Most of the things that change your life don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with noise or urgency or a clear line you can point to afterward and say, there. That's where it happened. They arrive the way night arrives, gradually, and then all at once. You don't realize you've crossed the threshold until you're already standing on the other side of it. And by then, the version of you that used to live back there already feels like someone else. I've been thinking about this for a long time. About the moments that don't feel like moments at all. About the changes that never asked for permission. About the slow, invisible erosion of oneself and the equally slow, equally invisible emergence of another. And about the first sign, the quiet, unmistakable sign that your life is beginning to move into something new. It starts before you have words for it. You're going through your week. The same conversations. The same obligations. The same rituals you've built your life around. And everything, technically, is fine. But something is different. Not wrong, exactly, just slightly unfamiliar. Like a room you've been in 100 times. But tonight the light is sitting differently, and you can't explain why it makes you uneasy. You catch yourself mid-sentence, saying something you've said before, and there's a hollow quality to it. As if the words are correct, but they no longer belong to you in the way they used to. Like you're reciting lines from a script that used to feel like your own voice, but now you can hear the performance in it. You sit with people you know well, people you've been comfortable with for years, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel like a stranger watching from a slight distance. Like you're almost there, but not entirely. And the strangest part is that nothing has happened. No event, no revelation. No obvious turning point. Just this quiet, persistent feeling that some internal furniture has been rearranged in the night, and your body hasn't quite learned where everything is yet. You might dismiss it. Most people do. They call it stress or tiredness or just a phase. They find a reason that fits neatly inside the life they already understand, and that explanation works for a while. It always works for a while because it's easier to name a temporary discomfort than to sit with the possibility that something more fundamental is shifting. But the feeling doesn't leave. It follows you into the quieter parts of the day, into the drive home, into the pause before sleep. Into the mornings when you wake up a few minutes before the alarm and lie there in the dark. Not anxious exactly, but aware. Aware of something you can't quite name pressing gently, but persistently against the inside of your life. Because it's not a symptom of something wrong with you. It's the first trace of something beginning. We spend a lot of time watching for changes in the world around us. The job that shifts. The relationship that ends. The city we leave or arrive in. We track our lives through these landmarks, before this and after, as though our interior selves were passengers in a story written entirely by circumstance. But that's not where it starts. The first sign that you're entering a new phase of life isn't external. It's perceptual. It's the quiet, unsettling moment when the lens through which you've been seeing everything begins to change. The things that used to feel important begin to feel not unimportant exactly, but differently weighted. The ambitions that once had an almost physical pull on you become quieter. The things people around you are urgently chasing start to look, from a certain angle, a little abstract. A little like a game whose rules you memorized without ever really choosing to play. And the things you once dismissed without much thought, solitude, depth, slowness, questions without answers, those start to have a gravity they didn't have before. It isn't cynicism. It isn't burnout, though it can masquerade as both. It's a recalibration. Your internal compass is adjusting to point towards something you don't have a name for yet. You start noticing things you used to move past without registering. You find yourself in the middle of a crowded conversation, thinking about something else entirely, something slower and more essential. You read a sentence in a book and have to stop, not because it's complicated, but because it's true in a way that feels uncomfortably specific, like it was written for a version of you that is only now arriving. You start paying attention to how you feel after certain interactions rather than just during them. You start noticing the weight of things you agreed to without thinking. You start hearing, for the first time, the low-level static of obligations and performances you've been running so long they became invisible. These are not distractions. They're data. They're the new lens finding its focus. And the sign, the first real sign, is simply this. You can no longer entirely inhabit your old explanations of yourself. You've outgrown them. Not dramatically. Just enough that they no longer fit without a slight, constant awareness of the edges. There's a particular kind of knowledge that can't be taught. It can't be read into existence, or reasoned toward, or acquired by wanting it badly enough. It can only accumulate, slowly, over years of actual contact with the world. The contact of trying things and watching them fail, of wanting things and, after getting them, finding the silence that follows louder than expected, of watching people you trusted reveal their limits, of discovering, with a quiet shock, your own. All of that leaves marks, not always visible ones, internal ones, a gradual layering of understanding that changes over time, what you're able to tolerate and what you're no longer willing to pretend. There's something that happens in the years between 30 and 50 that doesn't get talked about honestly enough. The world tends to treat that span of time as a plateau, a period of maintenance, of consolidating what you've built, of fulfilling the roles you've accepted. And on the surface, that's often what it looks like. But underneath, something else is happening. The accumulated weight of lived experience begins to press against the structures you built in your 20s, the beliefs you adopted without examining, the ambitions you inherited more than chose, the identity you assembled partly from genuine desire and partly from the expectations of people whose approval once felt essential. In your 20s, the question is often, who am I in relation to other people? By your 30s and 40s, it shifts. It becomes quieter, more interior. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I actually believe when I stop performing the version of myself I've been maintaining? It happens because you've accumulated enough experience to see through certain things. Not everything, but enough that the scaffolding you built your early life on starts to feel less necessary. And with it gone, you can see the structure beneath, what's actually holding you up, and what was only ever decoration. That's disorienting. It's supposed to be. Disorientation in this context isn't a malfunction. It's evidence that you're seeing something more clearly than you did before. And clarity, when it arrives after years of comfortable blurriness, is rarely painless. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because once the lens shifts, you can't unshift it. You can try to look away. A lot of people do. They add noise, busier schedules, more social obligations, more screens, more movement, anything to avoid sitting with the particular quality of quiet that this period produces. But it stays. It waits. It has a patience that the rest of your life doesn't. Old routines start to feel like borrowed clothes. You still wear them because that's what you do. You still show up, still perform the familiar functions of your life. But there's a low-grade friction in it now, a subtle resistance that wasn't there before. Places you used to find easy to inhabit start to feel slightly too small. Not the physical dimensions, the psychological ones. The bar you've been going to for years. The social circle that used to feel like home. The version of the weekend that you've been repeating so long, it stopped being a choice and became just what you do. All of it starts to carry a faint sense of constraint. Conversations that once felt sufficient begin to leave a residue of something unsatisfied. Not because the people are wrong, or the topics are shallow, but because you're bringing a different kind of hunger to them now, and the old formats aren't designed to feed it. And perhaps most disorienting of all, relationships that have been with you for years begin to reveal their true shapes more clearly than they ever did before. You start to see which ones require you to maintain a version of yourself you're no longer certain you believe in, which ones depend on your smallness, which ones only work when you agree not to ask certain questions or cross certain invisible boundaries, and which ones, the rarer kind, allow you to be whoever you're slowly becoming. This isn't ingratitude. It isn't a midlife cliché or a crisis looking for a name. It's the natural friction of a self that is no longer the right size for the container it's been living in. And the discomfort, as resistant as it is to easy comfort, is actually the most honest thing you've felt in a long time. It's telling you something true. There's a moment, and you may have already had it, or it may be coming, when you realize you're not quite one thing anymore, and not yet another. You're standing at a threshold, not in the dramatic sense. There's no ceremony here, no crowd, no clear announcement. Just the private, somewhat vertiginous awareness that the story you've been telling about yourself no longer covers all the territory. That there are parts of you, growing, pressing, asking questions, that the old story doesn't have room for. This is the threshold, the space between the person you've been, with all their familiar habits and certainties, and whoever comes next, a figure you can sense but can't yet fully see. And standing there, in that in-between, is one of the stranger experiences available to a human being. You're not broken, but you're not entirely intact either. Not in the way you used to be. Some of the old confidence, the easy, unexamined kind, has quietly dissolved, and in its place is something more uncertain, but oddly more honest, more awake. There's a specific loneliness that comes with this place, not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of having moved ahead of the version of yourself that everyone around you still expects to meet. You show up to your own life and feel faintly like a guest in a house that used to be yours. Not unwelcome, just not quite at home in the way you once were, and you can't fully explain it to the people close to you, because the language for it is hard to find, and because the explanation always sounds more dramatic than the experience actually is. It's not a crisis. It's not a breakdown. It's just a slow, quiet renegotiation with reality, and those tend to resist clean descriptions. That gap isn't a failure. It's an invitation, but it requires something most people are reluctant to give it: time, stillness, the willingness to not immediately resolve the tension. Let me say something that I think gets lost in how we talk about these periods. We've inherited a vocabulary for crisis. We know how to name depression, anxiety, burnout, existential dread. And many of those names are accurate and useful. But there's a kind of interior movement that those words don't quite capture, a transition that looks like instability from the outside, but is. Underneath, a form of profound maturation. The self is learning to sustain a different kind of weight. Not the weight of ambition or performance or social legibility, but the weight of actually knowing what you think, what you feel, what you can no longer pretend. That weight is real, and it takes time to get used to carrying it. What's happening at this threshold is a reorganization of the interior. The values you lived by without questioning are being examined, some of them for the first time. The identity you constructed, the one that made sense, in the context of who you needed to be at 25 or 30, is being quietly dismantled and rebuilt on a different foundation. Not replaced, rebuilt. There's a difference. The rebuilt self carries what was genuine from before. It keeps the parts of you that were always real and discards the parts that were borrowed, adopted to fit a context. or to satisfy an expectation, or to survive a particular season of life that has now passed. It doesn't happen cleanly. It doesn't follow a schedule. And it doesn't feel, from the inside, like growth. It feels more often like losing your footing in terrain you thought you knew. But that's what growth actually feels like most of the time. Not expansion, renegotiation. I've watched a lot of people misread this moment. Not because they're unaware, but because the cultural scripts available to them point in the wrong direction. We're trained to treat inner upheaval as a problem to be solved. Find the cause. Apply the remedy. Return to normal as quickly as possible. The idea that not returning to normal might be the whole point, that the disruption might be the intelligence, rarely gets taken seriously. So people rush. They make large external changes, new relationships, new cities, new careers, hoping that a shift in the outer landscape will quiet whatever is moving in the interior. And sometimes those changes are right and necessary. But more often, they're not the source of the unease. They're just the nearest available handle. The outer life can be rearranged entirely, and the inner one will still be waiting, patient as ever, asking the same questions in the same quiet voice. I've also watched people pathologize this period in ways that do real damage. They go looking for what's wrong with them, chemically, psychologically, relationally, and find diagnoses that explain the discomfort without illuminating it. And sometimes those diagnoses are accurate and important. But sometimes what gets labeled as dysfunction is, in fact, the beginning of a deeper kind of function. A self trying to find its actual shape rather than the shape it was pressed into. What I've come to believe, and this took a long time, and I don't hold it lightly, is that the periods that feel most like falling apart are often the periods that matter most. Not because suffering is instructive in some neat, redemptive way, but because when the constructed self is under enough pressure, when the performance is too exhausting to maintain, something underneath it becomes briefly visible. And what's underneath? Imperfect? Uncertain? More honest than anything you've managed to perform, is worth more than most people give it credit for. The mistake is to patch it over before you've had a chance to see it. The transitions that change a life most profoundly are almost never the loud ones. They're the ones that demand a particular quality of attention. The ones that require you to stop moving long enough to notice what's actually there, what's actually shifting, what's been quietly asking to be acknowledged for months or years. Marcus Aurelius, a man who was, by any external measure, living at the absolute peak of what a life could contain, spent years writing alone at night in a private journal. Not to be read, not to be remembered, just to think honestly, to examine what he actually believed underneath the role he was required to perform by day. What he was practicing, without naming it this way, was the discipline of self-honesty. The refusal to let the noise of his position drown out the quieter, more essential signal of his own interior. That practice is what this moment calls for. Not a solution, not a plan, not a rebranding of the self for the next chapter. Just the willingness to see clearly what is already there. The old certainties that have quietly dissolved. The new sensitivities that have taken their place. The questions that don't have answers yet, but are more honest than most of the answers you've been carrying. There's a kind of courage required for this that doesn't get much recognition. It isn't the courage of action. It isn't the courage of confrontation. It's the quieter, and in some ways, harder courage of sitting still long enough to hear yourself think, really think, without the usual interference of noise and performance and the urgent demands of a life that always has somewhere else to be. Every transformation that has ever meant anything to anyone began in a moment that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. A person sitting alone with their thoughts, noticing something they'd been avoiding, allowing something to shift that they'd been holding in place through sheer force of habit. That is where the real changes begin. Not in the decisions you announce, in the perceptions you can no longer deny. If you've made it this far, if any of this has landed somewhere recognizable, then I suspect you already know what I'm talking about. Not as an idea, as a feeling you've been carrying. Something in your life has quietly stopped fitting the way it once did. Some version of yourself that you maintained for years is showing its seams. Some question you've been postponing has started arriving more insistently, in quieter moments, when there's nothing loud enough to drown it out. I'm not going to tell you what that means for you specifically. I can't, and I wouldn't trust anyone who claimed they could. But I'll tell you what I believe about it, the ability to recognize these moments, to sit with them, instead of escaping them or reframing them into something more comfortable, is one of the less celebrated forms of human intelligence. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't produce immediate results. It doesn't give you anything to announce. It just asks you to pay attention to something true that you've been avoiding. And I think there's something important in the timing of when this happens for most people. It tends to arrive after enough life has been lived that the first urgent wave of becoming, the frantic construction of a self that can survive and succeed and be loved, has done its work. After the scaffolding is up, after the roles are filled, after the early hunger has been fed, at least partially, and then, in the relative quiet that follows, a different kind of question becomes audible. Not who can I become, but who am I actually? Not what can I achieve, but what do I actually value when no one is grading me on it? Those are harder questions. They don't have clean answers. They tend to unsettle more than they resolve, at least at first. But they are, I think, the questions that matter most. The ones that the first half of life rarely has enough silence to ask. In my experience, that's usually where the next version of a person begins. Not in some dramatic reinvention, not in the decision that changes everything in a single moment. In the quiet, unglamorous, necessary act of actually looking at where you are, of letting the old explanations go, of standing at the threshold without rushing to the other side. The threshold is always there. Most people walk past it their entire lives. You don't have to.